Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be painting acorns. This was requested by Marlene and I hope you guys also enjoy. Like usual, I'm going to begin by drawing out the shapes of the acorn. They're quite simple, but like anything else, they come in different shapes and form. Some are rounder and some are longer, but it's really up to you what you would like to include in your final painting. I'm pretty sure you guys already know the basic shapes of the acorn, and you can try to draw these out facing different angles with different shapes, but there is one important point that I would like to make, and you'll notice at the bottom of the tip of all of the acorns, there's this small point which protrudes out, and this determines the center of the acorn. Knowing where this is will come in very handy when you're drawing out the cross contour lines, which will make the acorn look more three-dimensional. The texture that we will make later as we paint will also depend on these cross contour lines. Just be mindful though, if you are painting a very frontal angle where you see the bottom, the center point would switch position. Instead of being at the very edge of the bottom, it would be inside of the shape, and therefore the cross contour would be indicated differently as the bottom of the other side is now visible. For the top of the acorns, I'm going to be adding this crisscross pattern, but we're going to paint the negative spaces instead, and I'll go over that in a bit more detail as we get to the painting. Next are the leaves, which I find has really cute shape. Again, they come in many varieties, but I like the soft edge ones, which I'm going to be painting in this video. You can also play around with the evenness of the wavy lines, like the third one that I'm drawing out right now, or you can just play around with the combination that you like. If you want to include folds, you can approach it by drawing out the folded side first with the wavy lines facing the same way as the other side, then add on the other side, which is slightly hidden behind the folds. And you can also play around with the length of this, so you can vary the angles of the folds if you would like to, but it's up to you. It is a little bit trickier to draw and paint, so you can include it or you can just keep the leaves nice and simple for your painting. Before I paint anything, I usually like to draw out quick thumbnail sketches just to get my ideas down on how I want the painting to be laid out. I'm just sketching a couple of examples here, but do as many as you need until you figure out the composition that you would prefer for your final painting. Once you figure out the composition, you can also practice shading the acorns just with pencil to understand the form, and also to make a decision on the placement of the value. Planning before your painting is always a good idea, so you don't have to think in the middle of the painting and you can focus more on the technicalities instead. Next, I'm going to quickly go over the colors. I'm keeping the color palette simple for this one with my Holbein set, and the colors I chose were Cobalt Blue, Terra Verde, Permanent Yellow Deep, Vermilion, Burnt Sienna, and Sepia. I don't usually show my sketching process, but I'll just show you a sped up version so you can see how I sketch and how much I erase and redraw the subject to get the position that I like. The overall sketch on this tiny sketchbook took me around 8 minutes in real life, so it's okay to take your time even if you're just drawing out simple outlines. Erasing really helps with cleaning out our line work, and planning beforehand really helps reduce erasing on your watercolor paper, since at the very least you'll know the rough composition of your painting. Or you could also take the route of drawing on scrap paper, then tracing it over to your watercolor paper to minimize erasing on your watercolor paper, as it could damage the fibers if you erase too much, especially if you are digging into the paper as you sketch. So if you are a little bit heavy-handed, I understand, because sometimes I also do that, especially if I don't sketch out thumbnails and figure out the layout first. And if that's the case, I would really recommend for you to draw it out on scrap paper and then trace it out. After I've done the basic outline, I also like to use my eraser to lighten the pencil marks by lightly erasing, then creating a clean, thin line over the outline. And this helps create a very soft outline for you so you can cover it easily with your paint. So here, once I'm ready with the outline, I'm going to just wet the outer part or the background of the drawing. This is to create a soft wet-on-wet effect, and this is essentially creating a barrier for the paint to travel, so I'm only wetting parts as far as I want the paint to go to. Once the surface is wet, then I'm going to start with the colors Cobalt Blue and Terra Verde, and I'm just placing them in those areas near the center and just letting the colors spread slowly. I'm also helping a little bit with my brush so the color gradually fades out. I'm using hot press paper today, which I find tend to spread less, so it might act a bit different if you're using cold press. I'm going to start by painting the acorns now, and I'm going to change up the colors slightly. For the first one, I'm going to create more of a yellowish brown color, so I'm mixing permanent yellow deep with a little bit of burnt sienna and a touch of sepia, and I'm just going to apply it on the first acorn. And again, because I'm using hot pressed paper, the lines I create is very crisp. So I'm making sure I'm painting the acorn already according to the cross section. So even if I'm only using one color at this point, the streaky texture will already start to help create the base of the form. As for the second acorn, I'm going to apply it the exact same way as the first one. And this time I'm going to use the same color, but I'm going to make the dominant color burnt sienna instead, so it's a little bit more brown, but the colors are still fairly bright and saturated. And because this color is darker in value compared to the first one, I also started to indicate the light area very subtly, so the top part I used a lighter consistency compared to the bottom part. Moving on to the third acorn, I'm going to use again the same three colors, but this time I'm going to use sepia and burnt sienna as the dominant colors with a touch of permanent yellow deep. I'm not making sepia the dominant color by itself because I find that the color is too muted and dark, which is why I added a fair bit of burnt sienna to brighten it up a little bit more. But because we still vary the ratio, you can still see the differentiation in color compared to the last two acorns. Here you'll also see that I tried to start separating the values because the main color has darker value compared to the first one. So I'm using the same method as I did with the second acorn. Now that we have the base color of the acorns and we have figured out the hues of the brown, I'm going to start layering to add more form and depth to the painting. I'm going back to the first acorn again, and I'm going to use the same mixture but with a bit more burnt sienna and a thicker consistency to create a slightly darker value. And I'm going to start placing them around the bottom darker areas of the acorn. Then as I slowly run out of paint on my brush, I start to paint the top part with the lighter load. Again, I'm doing this while following the cross contour of the acorn to keep the form. I'm going to just do the same with the second acorn. I'm using the same colors again, but with the addition of the darker colors. So with the second one, I added a touch more sepia with burnt sienna, all in a slightly thicker consistency than before to increase the contrast. For the third one, I used the medium to thick consistency of burnt sienna and sepia, but I tried to use a bit more burnt sienna here as, again, I don't want the sepia to mute the color too much, so I'm still keeping up the saturation of the painting. Moving on to the third layer, now I'm going to use the same color, but this time I'm also going to add vermilion into the mix. This is because I don't want to add too much brown and reduce the saturation. I still want the brown to be bright, but I don't want it to be too muted by using too much burnt sienna or sepia. Again, I'm using a slightly thicker consistency, so the colors are slightly darker in value, and from here on, I'm going to be mixing a lot of the colors by using what's already on my palette, so it's a bit hard for me to say specifically the colors that I used, and hopefully by including what I use in my palette in this video, it's a bit easier for you to follow along. Below the first acorn, I also added more sepia just for the bottom part, but I also softened it a bit more so the color blends nicely with each other. I'm just going to continue painting the last layer of the shadow for the acorn using the color that I've been using, and I'll get back to you once I'm ready to move on to the next step. For the last acorn, I did something a little bit different. So I mixed the sepia with vermilion for the bottom part, and for the top part, because I don't want it to look too red, I added some permanent yellow deep to the previous mixture and use a thinner consistency to add a slightly different hue and interest to the acorn. Next, I'm going to paint the top of the acorn, and for this I'm thinking of using a creamy brown color, and I used whatever I had left on my palette and adjusting the color to create a soft tone using a very thin consistency. You can also try this out on a scrap piece of paper first because it is harder to check softer colors, and I also decided to add a little bit of green to make the color more natural and give it a slight variation of hue to add interest. Again, I just keep layering this to separate the color value just like before, but because this color is much lighter than the bottom of the acorn, I keep adding a light consistency even as I layer to make sure that the color is not too strong. Don't forget to also add shadows at the bottom part so the form is more visible and separated from the bottom of the acorn. For the bottom of the acorn, I also used a thicker and darker color to show stronger separation, and I also added more sepia to mute the color. And even if I am using a fairly thin consistency because the color itself is already dark in value, it also works well as a shadow color. On top of that, I think that it also creates a nice contrast in terms of saturation because the bottom has a brighter and higher saturation in color, whereas the cup is a bit more muted. Moving on to the texture on the cup of the acorn, I'm going to create diamond or slanted squarish pattern, and to paint this, I'm going to use the side of my brush to create squares in a 40-degree angle. It is easier if you have a very small flat brush, but it is very doable to create this with a round brush as I'm demonstrating here. The size of those squares will depend on the pressure of your brush. You can also use a smaller brush for this if you would like to. And in terms of brush load, I would say to use a very light load because we're dealing with separate tiny shapes, so you don't want a heavy load which will cause a lot of puddling. For the color, I'm using a mixture of sepia and burnt sienna in a thin consistency, and I want to add an even lighter consistency where the light area is, and where the cup gets darker in value, I use more sepia in a slightly thicker consistency, but still with minimal load. Like the first one I made, I didn't think about the value too much, so I accidentally added a color that is a bit too dark, and if this happens you can use a tissue to pick up the excess, but because mine was drying off already, I wet the area again, then picked up the reactivated paint with tissue. Finally, onto the leaves of the acorn. I want to make this have a very fall vibe, so I first activated all of the colors on my palette that I want to include for the leaf, so I have easy access for the colors. I'm going to use Terra Verde, Vermilion, Permanent Yellow Deep, and Burnt Sienna with a touch of Cobalt Blue. And what I'm doing here is just alternate the colors on the leaf that I've drawn out. You can even change up the base color of the green, so you'll see me using Terra Verde straight up for the first one, and as for the second leaf, I use a warmer green with a mix of Terra Verde and Permanent Yellow Deep, then adding on those other hues while the green is still wet so they can blend nicely together. You don't have to combine all of the colors that you've activated in every leaf. In fact, I like to vary the colors slightly, but it still looks cohesive because we're still using the same colors overall to link everything together. As for the folded leaves, I like to separate the two layers using a lighter and a darker green, which I still like to mix with other hues as well. From here on, I'm just going to leave the leaves to completely dry, and meanwhile I'm going to paint and add more leaves loosely and in a very light consistency around certain empty areas, so they look like they're not as much in focus compared to the leaves that we just painted. And I'm keeping the colors simple, not worrying too much about mixing the hues because I am working in a tighter space. Lastly, I'm going to add the veins of the leaves, and for this I'm going to use whatever I have left on my palette. I tried to mix something that's a bit more on the greenish brown tone, and to paint this and to keep it natural, I'm painting it with the tip of my brush to keep the lines thin, and also making sure that I don't create stiff straight lines. Instead, I'm making the lines very crooked and the veins to also branch out. I find that this makes the leaves look more natural than if you were to paint it with completely straight lines. And that's basically the finished painting, but before I leave, I'd like to announce that part 2 of the owl painting for my Skillshare class is now out. This was such a fun painting to make because it involves many different techniques combined together in one painting. So if you guys are interested, you can find me on Skillshare or go to the link in the description box for a free trial. Just to let you know, starting from the 30th of September, the free trials will no longer be valid for 2 months, and instead it will be reduced to 14 days instead. So if you're interested in trying out Skillshare, I would suggest for you to try it out while you can get the longer trial period. Anyway, getting back to the acorns, this is the finished painting. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. It was really fun to paint, and like usual, the list of tools and links to my social media will be listed in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!